Hello, this is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com. This one is going to be an extravaganza, so brace yourselves. Here we go. We're talking about the best Tchaikovsky Symphony cycles. Now, something very strange has happened with Tchaikovsky. You know, he used to be the sort of go-to romantic composer who wasn't German that everybody did. And that's why there are so many. In fact, let me see if I can do this. I am sitting on this pile of 18 Tchaikovsky cycles. That's a chai in Hebrew. You know, in Hebrew numerology, the number 18 is the numerical equivalent of the letters that add up to make the word life. Chai. So if you have 18, it's a lucky number, and that's what we have here. So that will be a project to get through. But my point isn't that there are so many. My point is that most of the best of them are older ones, because it seems that Tchaikovsky has been displaced. He's been displaced first by Mahler and then by Bruckner, which I don't understand at all. I mean, to me, that's completely incomprehensible. Not that Bruckner isn't nice, but that Bruckner doesn't have anything like Tchaikovsky's popular appeal. Even now he doesn't, but you wouldn't know it to see what's happening in the discographies and what's happening in terms of, you know, the stuff that people are playing frequently. It's very, very strange. You know, I think part of the problem is that Tchaikovsky is Russian, and that Russian composers never had much respect, unlike German composers. In the academic world, there aren't Tchaikovsky scholars the way you see, you know, German scholars, the way there's Bruckner scholarship and Mahler scholarship and Beethoven and Brahms and all those people. And he's taken for granted. Everyone assumes he writes pretty tunes. They're beautifully orchestrated. They're popular. Everyone loves them. And because they're popular, they must not be as good as the stuff that's less popular, but more high-end. You know what I mean? Tchaikovsky is not an exclusive composer. And so I really think in today's world, where our concert life seems to be becoming narrower and narrower, and conductors are always looking for new repertoire, Tchaikovsky is kind of a has-been. I mean, that seems to be the way he's being treated, which is a tragedy, because Tchaikovsky was an astonishingly great composer, amazing, along with Brahms and Dvorak. He was part of that trio of great late 19th century composers who were versatile, who did a lot of different things. Not all of them did everything equally well, except possibly for Dvorak. But, you know, I mean, Brahms didn't write operas and ballets and that stuff. Tchaikovsky did write operas and ballets, but not so much chamber music. Dvorak did everything. But, you know, the bottom line is that Tchaikovsky's getting a bad rap nowadays. And so hopefully this chat will help us restore some of the luster to his reputation, because he was really just an amazing composer, even though nobody likes the Third Symphony. You know, I mean, he had his issues with form. He had some issues with you know, the fact that he personally hated everything he wrote, practically, almost invariably. He despised everything. And because his biography is so tormented, you know, he was the apotheosis of the tormented homosexual who got married for the wrong reasons, then tried to kill himself, and then finally may have killed himself, but they're not sure if he killed himself, or he may have been directed to kill himself, or he may have just died of cholera like everybody did. Who knows? But all of this biographical folderol and hoo-ha, you know, doesn't say anything about what a great composer he was, that he wrote great, great music. And of course, he wrote great, great tunes. And as I always say, musicology has no idea what to do with a tune. It cannot and does not attempt to assess the degree to which being able to write and score an amazing tune counts towards the larger structural coherence of the piece of music that you're writing. We can't evaluate it. All we know is that great tunes are great, and we want to hear them because they're great. And because of that, other aspects of form and harmonic theory and whatnot kind of go out the window, because that's the way we're constructed. And musicologists hate the way we're constructed. They don't want to deal with that. They want to be able to assess what happens with music on paper, not how it sounds in real time and how it makes you feel. And Tchaikovsky is the ultimate tactile composer. He was probably the greatest orchestrator for strings that ever lived. I mean, he could score a tune for strings. I mean, think of the big tune and the slow movement of the Fifth Symphony. You know, ya da 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 da. You know, and then the one of the sixth, the first movement of the sixth. You know, these things that became pop songs. But he could write for passionate strings with an expressive intensity that nobody, and I mean nobody, not Wagner, not nobody, ever matched. Tchaikovsky was the guy for that kind of thing. So we're going to talk about these 18 sets of Tchaikovsky symphonies. And there's some notable new ones that I'm not going to talk about. I'm not going to talk about Petrenko's recent one that was on Onyx, which is sort of it's okay, it's not great. I am not going to talk about the Semyon Bychkov with a Czech Philharmonic on Decca, which is just boring. Oh my God, it's boring. And that's what I mean by Tchaikovsky being sort of out of style. Not only is he played less, but people conduct him more poorly. He seems to be less well understood by today's generation of conductors. I can't explain it. I can't explain it except to say that it may be that younger conductors have a more modern sensibility and that Tchaikovsky doesn't fit. I mean, certainly we are in an anti-romantic age. I mean, the whole period instrument movement is predicated on taking expression out of music. And basically, that's what the strictures that they have adopted tend to do. And, you know, one of the things that's very, very interesting about this is that you don't see Tchaikovsky on period instruments, you know, strings with all the vibrato sucked out of them. I mean, yeah, Norrington did a Poetique. It was horrendous, as you might have expected, for just that reason, because it was completely expressionless. But to play Tchaikovsky with period instruments, even though people will do it with Bruckner, they'll do it with Brahms, I mean, the very idea sounds absurd, because he was in some ways the apotheosis of that romantic sensibility about the expression of passion. And to do that, you can't do what the period instrument people tell you must do in music of that period. And Tchaikovsky is like the elephant in the room. He's the thing that proves them all wrong in everything that they're telling you to do in romantic music. Because Tchaikovsky played on period instruments sounds horrible, just plain awful. But anyway, we're not going to have to deal with that, because there are no great Tchaikovsky cycles on period instruments. And there are no great Tchaikovsky cycles that attempt to play the music in period style, which is more than you can say for Brahms and even Bruckner and some of these other guys. So let's just get to the recordings, because we have to get through this somehow. And I'm going to start with a really lousy one, which I want you to avoid. This is Pletniev on pentatone. Now, Pletniev, you may recall, was a rather dull conductor before he knew how to conduct. Then he became a sort of perverted conductor when he learned how to conduct, which was not necessarily a better thing. But he began his career conducting, in the West anyway, with a Poetique symphony that was on Virgin that everybody raved about. It was a very nice performance. It was balletic. It was very attractive. It was pointed. It was obviously the orchestra knew it, so he got credit for what they were doing. Then he did all of them, including Manfred and symphonic poems and all that. Forget it. They were just so dull. And so we don't have to talk about them any longer. Avoid Pletniev. Period. Next, Rostropovich. Now, Rostropovich's cycle is very interesting because it was made here with the London Philharmonic. And I remember vividly when it came out on LP, and he wrote this incredibly defensive booklet note about, who the hell are you people to question me? I'm a Russian. You think I don't know how this music goes? I've been playing it all my life. I know what I'm doing. And the reason they were saying it is because first of all, the performances are a little bit sluggish. That doesn't mean they're not Russian, because actually Russian performances are a little bit sluggish. I mean, you think of the Rushdesvensky performances too. They're kind of heavy-handed. You know what I mean? They sweat. They're passionate, where they need to sweat. But they're still kind of heavy-handed, sort of noisier and more vulgar than the London Philharmonic is. But one of the biggest problems with this cycle was the sound. I mean, they sounded very muddy and tubby on LP. That has largely been cleaned up on CD. And now I listen to these, and they're not the most exciting Tchaikovsky performances in the world, but they're nice. I mean, they sound good. He does know what he's doing. He gets them to play. And one of the things that this does have is a Romeo and Juliet and a Francesca da Rimini, which are sensational. They were reference versions for both works, and they are just great. But, I mean, you may not want to get 6 discs just for those. He also has a Manfred, which he monkeys around with a little bit. He doesn't have the tam-tam at the end of the first movement, thank goodness. Much as I love them, I only love them where they're supposed to be for the most part, and where I say they should be, like in Palestrina. But the bottom line is, it's not a bad cycle. It really isn't, and it sounds a lot better on CD than it did on LP. Next we come to Claudio Abbado with the Chicago Symphony. Now, here's one of the things about people who do Tchaikovsky. They tend to do lots of Tchaikovsky. And they tend to do lots of Tchaikovsky for different labels. So figuring out exactly what they did and how and why is a real pain in the ass, I gotta tell you. I mean, Abbado did some very good Tchaikovsky on Deutsche Grammophon, you may recall, in Vienna for the most part. But this was a complete cycle, a new one in Chicago and for Sony, and nobody much cared for it. It's not bad. Again, it's really not bad. It's well played, obviously. It's decently conducted. It's a little bit cool emotionally, and it's Abbado, so it's a little bit fussy here and there. He musses around with the dynamics somewhat unnecessarily, and I don't think he has the fire in his belly to really go for the gusto, which is funny because he can do it in Verdi. Sometimes he does it, sometimes he didn't, but these Tchaikovsky performances are good. They're just good. I wish that they were great, but they're not. Next, we get good old Leonard Bernstein with the New York Philharmonic. Now, here we come to one of these fascinating facts about sort of the older generation of Tchaikovsky conductors. Now, remember, Tchaikovsky for centuries, even in Russia, was known for his 4th, 5th, and 6th symphonies. Those were the only ones people ever played. 1, 2, and 3 were real rarities. And then all of a sudden this mania for complete cycles popped up and people started doing them. And, Bernstein, this is true of Ormandy too, which we'll get to in a minute. Some of these conductors, they did the early ones and they did them really well. I mean, they were fresh discoveries because what they discovered was that these early symphonies, even the 3rd that no one much likes, the Polish Symphony, have tons of good Tchaikovsky in them. They really do. I don't know whether they're formally or conceptually as interesting as the last 3, but they're still awfully good, particularly 1 and 2. I mean, they're beautiful. And the people who were running around doing 4, 5, and 6, they only did 1, 2, and 3 once. I mean, Bernstein did the 4th twice. Everyone did them multiple times, but 1, 2, and 3, they usually only did once. And they usually did them really well. And Bernstein does them really well. He really does. And as far as 4, 5, and 6 go, you'll remember, he did 2 4s for Sony. There's the other one on DG, and then he did 5 and 6 again on DG, and they were really slow, weird-mannered, distended performances, although I loved the Patatique. I really did. And I've talked about that performance because it was the review that kind of got me started as a critic, and Bernstein himself, said so, that he liked that review. But it's a good cycle. And it's got some smoking. I mean, Romeo and Juliet's wonderful, and he always did Hamlet fabulously. Recorded that twice as well, too. And Francesca. All of these were really well done. He adds, some extra cymbal crashes in the finale of the 4th. But hey, And now it's time for me to tell you about the finale of the 4th. I was playing the finale of the 4th, and it has a bear of a cymbal part, as you probably know. At the end, you're going check, 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 it's going crazy. And I was playing, and I had a tux shirt in those days. It was community orchestra. You take your old tux out and, put it on and hope it still fits. Well, this one, it didn't really fit. And and I had a shirt with an old-fashioned tux shirt with studs, and I'm wanging away at the cymbals at the end, and I look down, and I'm completely bare-chested because every stud had just popped out. Where they went, I don't know. Maybe a couple were in the tuba who would have dumped it out, and they would have poured out. But there I was going, yeah, like this. I got a terrific ovation, but I was shirtless by the time that movement was over. And it's only 8 minutes of music. It's hard to play at the end because you're going crazy. And it's actually an indication of both the type of instrument the percussionist uses and the tempo the conductor chooses, that there should be clarity of articulation in that part. And often there isn't. So next, Tchaikovsky symphonies with Zubin Mehta. You also get a great 1812 overture, the Capriccio Italienne, Romeo and Juliet, the March Slav, the Swan Lake and Nutcracker Suites. This was, in the Zubin Mehta box. Very good. Good, solid, romantic music making. Well recorded. Again, not the most exciting, perhaps not the most imaginative Tchaikovsky cycle out there. It's very traditional in its conception, but it's within those parameters, it's quite well done. You could do worse. It's very enjoyable to listen to. Now, here's sort of a sleeper cycle. This is one you're probably not going to think about very much. Let me see if I can take the booklet out. Nah, it's no point. Pardon the glare. This is Maurice Abravanel with the Utah Symphony. Now, Abravanel, in my little tribute to Abravanel, recorded like everything. I mean, really tons and tons and tons of stuff with this basically second-rate orchestra. And it's amazing how good some of these performances are. It's not just that, they weren't a great orchestra, but Abravanel just made them attack the music with a certain freshness. There's a liveliness to these performances. They don't have the weight of, like Vienna or Berlin. The strings don't have that kind of weight, but the performances themselves are so lively and rhythmically sprung. You know what I mean? They have freshness and bounce and vivacity, and there's a great Manfred in here. A really surprisingly good Manfred, all things considered. Abravanel is almost never boring. And that counts for a lot in Tchaikovsky, because Tchaikovsky is a composer who has dead spots, and it can easily turn dull. So, this isn't my favorite, but I have to. The funny thing is, even while I understand that the playing is not going to be as great as in some other ones, it's not like Barbaroli and Halle, where the playing really does get in the way of enjoyment. Here, I don't hear it that way. I just enjoy the performances. They're wonderfully enlivening performances. It's healthy Tchaikovsky. It's not morbid and decadent and dismal. It's beautiful. So, and it costs it's like $20 or something. It's 5 discs on Vox. You might want to consider it. You really might want to consider it. If you've got, a few bucks to spend and you're just curious, give it a try. And after that, we come to Loren Maazel. Now, this, of course, is great because you get the Vienna Philharmonic. Which is one thing. Maazel is another one of those guys. He recorded Tchaikovsky. He just dripped Tchaikovsky as he went from label to label to label, from Sony to DG, from, this is Telarc. Remember the Telarc 4th with Cleveland? It was very exciting. They're all good performances. Again, he grew up with the music, with the style. He understands it. He's Maazel. He does weird things now and then. The sad thing about this box is it doesn't include his Manfred, which is great with the Vienna Phil. That's really one of the best Manfreds out there. Again, it has sometimes odd balances and sounds because it's Vienna and because it's Maazel, and they make it very much their Tchaikovsky, but it's a good cycle. It's a very, very good cycle, and it's worth listening to. Definitely worth listening to. Also worth listening to, Antal Dorati on Mercury Living Presence. Dorati, of course, was a great Tchaikovsky conductor because he was a ballet conductor, and he made seminal recordings of the ballets. He was the first guy to do complete Tchaikovsky ballets, with any sort of regularity, and they are wonderful. And his Tchaikovsky symphonies are very similar. He's approaching them from the sort of ballet angle. They are recorded with that typical Mercury living presence. They're high level, in your face, take no prisoners sonic recordings. There are a couple things that I object to. Most significantly the fact that the coda of the finale of the First Symphony in this set is unquestionably the most vulgar thing I've ever heard anybody do ever in the whole world. I think partly it's because the tempo is just a little bit on the slow side, and the trumpets are going nuts, and it's like wah 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 wah, you know, bum dum dum da da dum dum bum da da dum dum. It goes on, and it gets just louder and more annoying, and it's, you know, partly the fault is Tchaikovsky's. Let's not kid ourselves, but it's Dorati too. It's kind of fun in its way, but I wouldn't call it, you know, an example of Tchaikovsky at his greatest or conducting of Tchaikovsky at its greatest. But otherwise, they're very good performances and eminently enjoyable. They're part of that common practice of romantic music that everybody seemed to be doing in the 50s and 60s and maybe up to the 70s, and that very few people still remember how to do now. And it's a surprise. It's a surprise. I'm not sure when it started to vanish. I'm thinking, you know, there was Litton's Tchaikovsky cycle, there was Slatkin's Tchaikovsky cycle. They had wonderful moments, but sort of real dead spots in places. I mean, they started not to be able to carry the energy through like whole big movements of things. And both Slatkin and Litton are fabulous Russian music conductors generally. But something happened with the Tchaikovsky symphonies. I'm going to figure it out someday. I'll put my finger on it. Maybe you have some ideas about it. Oh, and here's a good cycle. This one gets very little press. Yuri Temirkanov with the Royal Philharmonic. It's very well done. It's very well recorded. It's enjoyable. He's a vintage Russian guy, and he knows how to do his Russian stuff. I kind of wish he'd done a Manfred. I'll bet it would have been fun. I really do. But unfortunately, he hasn't yet. So maybe there's still time. You never know. Then a classic, Ormandy. Now here's the deal with Ormandy. First of all, he does Manfred, and he does Manfred quite well. It's a pretty good Manfred, and it was one of his better RCA versions. The thing is, Ormandy, like all these guys, did Tchaikovsky a million times, and he did, you know, the original stereo cycle in the 50s and early 60s in Philadelphia for Columbia, now Sony, and then he remade all of them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and Manfred for RCA. And what you get in here is the RCA stuff. You don't get the Sony stuff. I'm trying to see here. No, you don't. Now, he's a guy who, when he did 1, 2, and 3, did a really, really fine job with them. They're excellent performances. Also, the Manfred's very good. But in 4, 5, and 6, I think some people would prefer the Sony versions, even though some of them don't sound very good. But, you know, you get Portamento in the Fifth Symphony, you know, in the second subject of the first movement, ya-da-da-dum, ya-da-da-da, ya-wa-da-da-da. It's great, you know, and it's not there in the RCA version. It was like the first thing I listened to when the RCA ones came out. Do they still do the Portamento? Well, they didn't, damn it. It was so irritating. But fine, he was a fine Tchaikovsky in Philadelphia. It's a fine orchestra. It's a terrific set. It really is. So I'm not too worried about that. Now we come to some Russian guys. Let us see what we have here. Yevgeny Svetlanov. Now, Svetlanov did 3. This is his original Melodia stereo one. Then he did, toward the end of his life, he did for Exton or Canyon Classics or whatever it was in those days. He did a studio Tchaikovsky cycle, which is fabulous. It's absolutely first rate. And he also had this one, which is the Live in Tokyo cycle, which is a smoker. I mean, it's live, it's thrilling. It has 2 issues, and I'm going to tell you what they are. Otherwise, this is a box you got to hear. The first issue is that the Second Symphony, the Little Russian at the end, the orchestra gets a little out of whack. The percussionists get lost. It's a little embarrassing, and it's kind of funny at the same time. It happens in live performances. The second is that he does Manfred, but the version of Manfred he does is the traditional Russian cut version, which is no. It's just bad, with cuts of the finale and all kinds of other rescorings and things messed around with. So, I mean, it's exciting as hell. It really is, but it's ethically and morally indefensible. But this is, in all other respects, a really hot Tchaikovsky cycle. But if you want to have, better playing, and that kind of thing, then get his studio one on the same label, basically. This Melodia one is indifferently recorded, shall we say? And this was back in the days when, the glory days of Soviet playing, when it would peel the paint from your ceiling in loud spots, when the recording let it, which was not always. I don't think that it's as long as these newer ones are available, there's no point in getting those old Melodias. There really, really isn't any point. Now we come to Maris Jansen's on Chandos. This was a fascinating discographic happening. This also includes Manfred. But here was the thing. Now, some of you may recall, Chandos released the fifth as a single initially, and it blew everyone away. It's a great Tchaikovsky fifth. I mean, it had amazing discipline, it had passion and energy, and it introduced the world to the Oslo Philharmonic as a world-class orchestra. It was a shocker. It really was. And everyone got really excited. So, of course, they decided to do all of them. And the fifth was the best one. It's that simple. All of these others, they're good. They're not as well recorded. The recordings are really sort of lacking in bass information. And I mean, the playing is good, but it's typical Maris Jansen's. It's that neat, precise, disciplined, rhythmic kind of clone of Yevgeny Muravinsky, but not quite as intense style of playing. And they're very good. They're definitely very good. The Manfred, I think, is boring. The other ones are all very, very listenable, and they're all of a type. They're very consistent. But the fifth was the outstanding one. And it was you think, maybe they shouldn't have done a cycle. Maybe they should have just released the fifth and left it at that. You know what I mean? But they didn't. So we have them all, and I think they're kind of average. It's also a very expensive box. It hasn't gotten a lot cheaper, so I don't know if there's much point in spending the money. So believe it or not, we're already down to my final five. Isn't that great? I mean, didn't time just fly? It just flew along. And, I could also do a talk about 4, 5, and 6, but I'm going to make your life easy. For 4, 5, and 6, get Ashkenazi if you can find it. Muravinsky you have to have, and you're set. Other great 4, 5s, and 6s are in these sets, so you don't have to worry about that. But if you're going to get a set that just has 4, 5, and 6, you've got to have either Muravinsky or Ashkenazi, and then you're in business. Now, here are the top five. Top five. Number one in the top five, or five, the countdown. 5, Haitink. Haitink. This was a surprise for me because Haitink, as you know, can be rather placid. He can be a little dull, but he can also, in music that, I said this before, remember about Shostakovich's 12th, in music that needs a little help, he can really shine because he was so musical. He had such a fine musical sensibility and such a great orchestra, and he could basically get up there and say, guys, we're just going to do our best with what we do. And it works. It really works. I mean, these are gorgeous, gorgeous performances. I mean, the fifth is magnificent. They're all great. Their performances are all terrific. The Manfred's really good. You wouldn't think, but it's a really fine Manfred because the music just flows beautifully and the playing is so captivating. It just captures your attention and holds it from the beginning to end. All of Haitink's tempos are sensible. He doesn't whip things up into that crazy frenzy that you'll hear with Svetlanov and some other people in some individual performances. He doesn't, but he doesn't need to. It really is, it's almost like he's the Eugene Ormandy of the digital age. You might want to call it that. But this is a symphony cycle, this Haitink Concerto cycle, that has really, really held up well. You can take this out on any day, pop it on, and you'll think you're listening to the most beautiful music in the world. I mean, it's just that simple. It's a great set. Next in the greatness category, Karajan. Now, Karajan is a real problem. Karajan is because he recorded more Tchaikovsky than any other composer. He did more Tchaikovsky cycles than Beethoven. He did more than anybody. He did Tchaikovsky. There are mono ones. There's EMI stuff. I think he did a couple on EMI. He did 3 or 4 for DG, depending on the symphony, because he did the last 3 all over again in Vienna just before he died. Then he did this whole complete cycle. But like most of these people who do endless versions of 4, 5, and 6, he only did 1, 2, and 3 once. These are also great performances. They really are. His second analog fifth is sort of better than his first analog fifth. The only trouble with Karajan's performances is that, as usual with Karajan, he's all strings. And Tchaikovsky is largely all strings, so it's okay, except in places like, in the Fifth Symphony, in the finale, it's going dum bum 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 ba da 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 dum bum 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 ba da 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 da. Then the woodwinds come in da 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 dum ba da da dum ba da 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 bum bum bum. Right? Okay, you know what I mean, right? You want to hear the woodwinds. You just want to hear them, and you never do with Karajan. Karajan, you only hear horns going wham 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 wham, and the strings are all buzzing and ferociously sawing away. He never gave woodwinds an opportunity. You need to adjust the dynamics in places like that so that the melody comes through, and he doesn't. It just annoyed me. But that's possibly the only quibble I have about these performances. They are glorious. Karajan's sound was right for Tchaikovsky. It's that big, rich, saturated string sound. And he would allow the brass to really play out these performances, these symphonies, in the way he wouldn't always with the German repertoire. And they just have a grand time, and it's great playing. And these were not his latest recordings when he couldn't hear and everything got screechy. And it's a wonderful set. It's a great, 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 great Tchaikovsky Symphony cycle, and I can recommend it wholeheartedly. It's one of the things that lends credence to my theory that Karajan was actually better in the non-Germanic repertoire. If only because the non-Germanic repertoire was better suited to the kind of sound he preferred to get from the Berlin Philharmonic. I mean, for the same reason his Schumann is virtually unlistenable, his Tchaikovsky is fabulous. It's the same sound, but it doesn't suit everything. It works with Tchaikovsky. Now we're coming to my top 3, and here is the modern cycle by a guy who really still knows how Tchaikovsky's supposed to sound. Here you go. The London Philharmonic, again, this was, remember, Rostropovich's orchestra? It's the London Philharmonic with Vladimir Jurovsky. Now this is the real deal. It's on the LPO's own label. You also get, you do get Manfred, and it's the best Manfred available in modern sound, unquestionably. You get, Francesca, and you get the Serenade for Strings, and that's it. All right. I thought there was a Romeo and Juliet here. No, there isn't. But, these are live performances. The audience is generally well behaved, but they're live in the best possible sense. They have energy and excitement, and an orchestra that's really on its toes, and a conductor who's not afraid to cut loose and has no inhibitions, and the sound is really good. And if you're going to get a modern Tchaikovsky cycle that shows you that there are still people around who know what Tchaikovsky is supposed to sound like, then this one, Jurovsky, is your guy. It's on the LPO's own label, London Philharmonic Orchestra. What a wonderful achievement. Everybody should be hugely, hugely proud of. Also an achievement everybody should be proud of is my number 2. And it's very interesting. All of my top versions come from London. Different orchestras, but they all come from London, which gives lie to the theory that the British are cold fish. Certainly not here, not in these Tchaikovsky symphonies, but on the other hand, none of these are conducted by British conductors. So maybe there is some truth to it. I don't know. You'll have to tell me. Riccardo Muti with the Philharmonia. You get another great Manfred, and you get fabulous performances of all the other symphonies. This was the young Muti at his absolute finest. Red-blooded, passionate, exciting, totally on his toes at all times, marvelously disciplined, razor-sharp orchestral playing, generally very good sound for the most part. There are some performances that are a little less good than others, but on the whole, absolutely first class. There is no finer Tchaikovsky cycle available. And this will always do you proud. If you need the basic symphonies with Manfred and some of these other things, there's Francesca, and you get Romeo and Juliet, although some of those are with Philadelphia. And his Philadelphia remakes, as is always the case, were not necessarily as good, although in the tone poems they were very good, in the symphonies less so. But these Philharmonia recordings of the symphonies, I mean, this is sort of my go-to set most of the time. One of two. However, there is one other set that is probably the best overall for Tchaikovsky symphonies. Some of you may know what it is. It is Markievicz. I think I can take this one out of the box. Yes, I can. Here we go. Get rid of the glare. Markievicz with the London Symphony Orchestra. This is the licensed version on Newton Classics. It was in the Philips big Tchaikovsky box. It was like Philips Duos, I think, issued it. It's around. This is still available. I just checked on Amazon, and it's cheap. It's really cheap. It's like $15. Markiewicz's Tchaikovsky is extraordinary for several reasons. First of all, he was himself something of an anti-romantic, but he was also a supreme musician who knew what the music is supposed to sound like. So these performances, they don't get sticky. He tends to be swift, where other people slow down and moon around and do things. He doesn't linger in that sense. But my gosh, the playing is razor sharp. The performances are exciting. There's no want of passion anywhere. None of it's underplayed. None of it is inhibited in any way. He's not being cute. He's not being, merely neat and clean. It's not Neville Mariner. It's down and dirty Tchaikovsky, but with a modern sensibility. Almost the way Mravinsky did it in a sense. It's not as like fast and razor crazy disciplined like Mravinsky, but the aesthetic is somewhat similar. Not to sentimentalize Tchaikovsky. You can be romantic and you can be passionate without being saccharine, without being sentimental. And that's what Markievicz is. It's extraordinary. The playing is really great. These were, early Philips recordings from the 60s. And he really whipped the orchestra into terrific shape. I think this is, on average, on balance, the best Tchaikovsky symphony cycle that's out there today. This, Muti, Haitink, Jurovsky, you do well with any of them. Now, Manfred is not included in here, and he did Manfred, and it wasn't very interesting. Interestingly enough, it wasn't very interesting, because I think there's a case where the unsentimental approach just doesn't work. Manfred is all over the place, and you have to go crazy or don't bother. And Markievicz was just too controlled to do that. It's kind of a shame, because you would have thought, right? But with all of that said, these are first-rate Tchaikovsky symphonies. And there are other cycles out there. You know it. I know it. There's another Nimi Yarvi cycle out there somewhere, I think. There's so many of them. So many of them. It's crazy. They're just endless. But I think these 18 will really give you a good sense of what the range of interpretive options, the range is in these symphonies, and what works in Tchaikovsky and what doesn't. And there's no shortage of options and opportunities. But what I really want to make, the point I really want to make is, you have to keep on listening. Keep on listening to Tchaikovsky. He's a great composer. And don't fall into that strange sort of anti-romantic bubble we're in, where, music that's entirely emotionally about negativity is somehow prized, or music that's emotionally inhibited or emotionally limited in some way. This is the real deal. Spontaneous, passionate, magnificent. Listen to it. Thank you, and take care.